Now, let us commence the first session. I would like to welcome Dr. Astaire. Good morning, Andrew. Over to you.
Good evening, Minister KOIZUMI. Thank you for organizing this. And good evening, good afternoon, good morning to all of you. Welcome to session one. We've already heard 4 statements that are really powerful. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Secretary Espinosa, and how great to hear both the Prime Minister and the Secretary General so coherent and committed on this issue. Look, our exam question today is straightforward, but it's a very difficult one. It is that every nation on the planet is now trying to figure out how to navigate through and dig itself out of the worst crisis we've had in 100 years. At the same time, every smart nation is recognizing that we can't wait to address the unbelievable challenges that we face in this make or break decade. Challenges primarily of climate change, but by no means only climate change, biodiversity, the ocean. We have a decade in front of us that truly is make or break. And the smart countries are trying to figure out, how do we use this short-term crisis management in order to get to the revolutions we need in energy, in cities, in food systems, in manufacturing and consumption that will be required in order for us to get to where we need to get to over the longer term. And Minister KOIZUMI, you've selected this word redesign, and I think it's a terrific word. We have to redesign economic and social systems so that we become more resilient, even as we grow and even as we look after the world's environment. So this first session of 45 minutes is going to be quick fire, a deep dive. We have a wonderful a group of people. We've got Vera Songwe, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa. We've got Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, brand new as head of the Global Environment Facility. Congratulations, Carlos. Mary Robinson, President Mary Robinson, previously President of Ireland, High-Level Commissioner of Human Rights, member of the Elders, and giant on human rights issues. And then we've got Mark Carney, who was Governor of the Bank of England and has probably done more to think about how financial systems need to change than anybody else. So I'm going to be asking each of them some questions. But before that, would like to invite you, Minister KOIZUMI, to say sort of really what you had in mind with this notion of redesign. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. The world's socio-economic system is in dire need of redesigning. As I came to realize the urgency of the need, I chose to name this ministerial meeting Platform for Redesign 2020. 3 transitions are at the core of our redesigning work: the transition to a decarbonized society, the transition to a circular economy, and the transition to a decentralized society. Today, I would like to focus particularly on the transition to decarbonization. First, shift in the energy policy holds the key to decarbonization. Now, let me present Japan's recent revision of its policy on export of coal-fired power plants. Regarding newly planned coal-fired power generation projects, the government will not, in principle, support the installation of newly planned projects in countries where the government of Japan does not have complete knowledge about their policies toward decarbonization. This decision to put restriction on Japan's support is unprecedented. As Prime Minister Abe says in his video message, under the ambitious goal of global decarbonization, we have drastically changed our long-standing policies on coal-fired power plants and have shown our unwavering commitment to realize a decarbonized society. Second, the national government has an important responsibility to support and encourage non-state actors' initiatives and movements. I have successfully created a movement to make decarbonization an irreversible trend, together with local governments. The number of Japanese zero-carbon cities or local governments committing to achieving zero-carbon emissions by 2050 has jumped from 4 when I was just appointed Minister of the Environment to over 150 within a year. The coverage exceeds half of Japan's population at around 70 million people. ESG finance is also crucial to redesign the flow of money to drive our economy. Encouraged by the government's continuous provision of support and guidance in ESG, Japan counts the highest number of businesses and organizations which are members of TCFD. Further, Japan ranks second in its commitment to SBT and third in its participation in RE100, standing as a leader in Asia. Japan's major businesses organizations are also supporting rapid transition to a decarbonized society. They are engaged with efforts to achieve zero emissions through the introduction of renewable energy. Enhancing coordination among all relevant ministries is essential in tackling the climate emergency. It may sound unexpected, but I work closely with the Ministry of Defense. Switching their energy source from diesel to renewables is beneficial in enhancing the self-reliance of forces and in advancing climate actions. We will continue to promote coordination among ministries in introducing renewable energies and promoting adaptation measures. As I have elucidated so far, we have made significant progress on many fronts since we submitted our NDC this March. Moving forward, we are pursuing further reduction efforts both in the medium and the long term and accelerating our work to submit additional information by COP26. Furthermore, the review of reduction target in the NDC will be carried out consistently with the revision of the energy mix so as not to be held up until the next deadline for quinquennial submission, pursuant to the Paris Agreement, building on policies and measures on all GHGs and aiming at aspiring figures to reflect further ambitious efforts. As stated by Secretary General Guterres in his video message, Japan can become a world leader of the sustainable and resilient recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Japan is ready to lead the global redesigning efforts with the three transitions that we advocate. I look forward to hearing from the panelists as you are standing at the very forefront of these efforts of transition. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for those really helpful words. Let's turn now to the panelists. I'm going to ask each of them for their first question, just to be fairly brief, between 1 and 2 minutes, so that we can hear your voice, get to know you, and then we'll come back for a second question and hopefully then open it up to discussion. Vera Songwe, head of the Economic Commission for Africa. You are doing a great deal of work on the economics of the transition. You talk a lot about energy, and in particular energy for Africa. Would love to hear your advice to ministers of environment, finance, planning, and to the international community.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. President Mary Robinson, of course, Carlos, Your Excellency, Minister KOIZUMI, Mark, a pleasure to be on this panel with you today and to be talking about a subject which I am quite passionate, which is energy and what we do with energy and the recovery. I think, thank you. What do we say to ministers? Listen, particularly on our continent, we have suffered like everybody else for the first time in 25 years. Africa is getting into an economic recession. We were hoping as we started 2020 that we were going to be celebrating the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, pushing private sector engagement, creating more jobs. We need to create 13 million jobs on the continent. All that is a little bit out the window. However, I think two things have happened that show us that there is some possibility of turning this around and making a positive out of it. And I am really, really excited about hearing from Prime Minister Abe saying that, Japan is going to be going out of coal and looking at more renewable investment. This essentially means that there are going to be additional resources for renewable energy. When we talk about energy on the African continent, and I want to be clear, we're not talking about lighting households. We're talking about powering industry. So we need a lot more energy. The megawatts of energy that we use on the continent today, just in terms of numbers, is about our total capacity of energy on the whole continent, 1.3 billion people, it's about 600 kilowatt hours per year, compared to 7,800 kilowatt hours per year in Japan, 4,600 in China, and 1,000 in India. So you see, we are 600 compared to 7,800, Minister Koizumi. I want you to remember this number. And I think this is where the crux of Building Back Better happens. It happens because we decide that we are going to reinvest in clean energy for industrialization on the continent. And when we talk about industrialization, again, we're not just talking about industry as in sort of, factories. We're talking also about technology. We're talking about something that you have done really well in Japan and in Ireland. There is a lot of work going on, and that is the service industry. 40% of the service industry markets here, the financial sector, is energy. We need to power the trading platforms. We need to power the accounting services. Those are the ones who actually use a lot more energy. And so we need that energy on the continent. The recovery for Africa is going to be in the service sector, it's going to be in the manufacturing sector, but it cannot happen if we don't have energy and if we don't have clean energy. Now I'm going to leave one sort of debate on the floor as I close my 2 minutes. As you said, Minister Koizumi, and I think as the Prime Minister also said, we are transitioning from coal and heavy fuel oil. 32 cents per kilowatt hour is the cost that we are paying on average on the continent for heavy fuel oil, and we need to move that. Now we have a number of countries on the continent, Mauritania, Senegal, Mozambique, and you see where I'm going, that have discovered gas. We can use gas as a just transition into how we get to renewable energy. And I want to ask all of us that we start thinking about what does this mean, how do we finance it, and how we can ensure that Africa really gets this just transition right by using this new and discovered and much, much cheaper energy access that we can use to power our industry and create the 13 million jobs we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera, very much indeed. And thanks for being so frank at the end on that, the difficult issue of gas as well. Carlos Rodriguez, you've been Minister of Environment 3 times, Minister of Environment and Energy 3 times, so you know the challenges of getting things done. But when you were Minister, you doubled the forest area of Costa Rica and you went to 100% clean and renewables. So you obviously know how to get things done, and we look forward to your tenure at the GEF. You recently said that restoring nature is not a burden to economic development. What did you mean, and how would you encourage ministers who are listening as they think about this idea of redesign that Minister Koizumi spoke about?
Well, thank you so much, Andrew, and let me say hi to Minister Koizumi and my dear friends from the panel. And Mark, Vera, and Mary. Yeah, you're correct. Restoring nature is a economic sound decision, or let me put it better, Andrew. Restoring, protecting nature is a good, sound economic investment. Many countries has proven, and there's a lot of economic information and data on the economic return on nature conservations. So the experiences are there, and the science is there. So we need to understand that in terms of dealing with this COVID crisis, probably the most important things as we talk about the redesign. 2 things are extremely important to me to share with you. One is the one associated to values and principles. We need to understand that COVID-19 is the byproduct of the conflict within humans and nature. And this is fundamental. We need all to understand this. And we need to set a new, guidelines of values and principles that will avoid us to continue in this conflict within humans and nature. And here's where I've been talking with Minister Koizumi for many months on really mainstreaming the concept of Satoyama, which is a great approach from the Japanese culture, whereby Satoyama tells us that there are many ways by which we humans can really work hand in hand with nature, that there can be a real balance within productive landscapes. And this is something which is extremely important. We need to redefine values and principles associated within the relationship of humans and nature. It's not a matter of just addressing the market failures. It's not a matter of coming with a new economic circular system. For me, the most important principle is associated to principles and values, and this is extremely relevant. So the redesign of our world must start then with the commitment by government to develop and pursue smart and environmentally sound choices that can boost our local economies at the same time that we contribute to a resilient planet for all mankind. In this respect, the global policy context for this already exists, primarily with the SDGs and with the multilateral agreement. But governments, Andrew, governments cannot do this alone. They need a strong engagement and commitment by development partners, civil society, and perhaps and most importantly, by an active private sector. This can only be achieved through a strong collaborative engagement by all sectors at the appropriate scales, meaning from the local to the national to the regional. Also, multilateral development banks, as well as the private sector investments, have a pivotal role to play in this integrated approach to sustainability. And I think that the example of promoting a circular economy, which is particularly critical now in these COVID-19 times, given the tremendous rise in waste, the GEF and many other organizations are mobilizing resources to support the development of national and local solutions to many of the problems associated to this crisis. So when it comes to decarbonization and circular economy, the long-term experience with the GEF investment supports the common sense or understanding that a well-designed policy drives private sector investment, which is critical in this context, not just having political willingness, but setting the right policies, going from perverse and negative investment and into positive ones, and the sector will drive the change. So in many geographies, even where the policies to support the transition toward broad environmental sobriety has been adopted in the last few decades, we still have a lot to do in terms of creating the proper legal framework, policy frameworks, and most importantly, Andrew, and I'll finish with this, we need to redesign the institutional framework. So you mentioned it. I was the Minister of Environment, Energy, Mining, Water of Costa Rica. Costa Rica does the classic division of agencies that manage natural, non-renewable and renewable natural resources. The Costa Rica has just one agency. This has gave us the possibility to be today 100% renewable energy and zero deforestation. It's a good example of how countries can deal with institutional failures. So we need to not only go towards a circular economy, redesign our principles and values, we need, Andrew, to really do a major investment in redefining the institutional framework that looks at the landscape or seascape in an integrated manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, very much. It's hard to get it into 1 to 2 minutes, isn't it? But thank you very much indeed. President Mary Robinson, you've devoted your life to the vulnerable and to human nature, basically. You said something very interesting recently, which is that you felt that in this present crisis, people were perhaps willing to make bigger changes than they might otherwise. What did you mean by that, and why is that relevant to policymakers?
Thank you, Andrew. And first of all, a big thank you to Minister KOIZUMI for convening this platform for Redesign 2020. I'm already very encouraged by many of the things I've heard. And also greetings to my fellow panelists, Vera, Carlos, and Mark. I wanted to echo what actually has already been said today, which is that the convergence, as Patricia put it, between COVID and climate has opened a window for going forward because it has disrupted us. It has changed our behavior. And I think, first of all, we have to admit that COVID-19 has actually exacerbated the inequalities in our world. The racial inequality, the gender inequality, the social inequalities, they've all been exacerbated, and we've seen more clearly the intersectionality between these inequalities. But it has also taught us good lessons. The first lesson is that human behavior matters. That is what is protecting us from the virus. Our ability to obey lockdown if necessary, to obey social distancing, hand washing, all the other protocols. And that will be important when we are coming into Build Back Better as consumers, particularly in the richer parts of the world. Not to be consuming as much, not to be wasting as much. It will be important to do that. Secondly, it has shown us that government matters. And Andrew, you'll forgive me if I said that women-led governments have been done particularly well because they took tough decisions early, listened to the science, and brought their people with them. Thirdly, science matters. Governments are now, making announcements side by side with their health experts. We now need to listen much more to the climate scientists, particularly the IPCC, which told us how important it was to stay at 1.5 degrees, and then we will take the necessary decisions. And the other fourth point is a more subtle one, but I think it's important. Compassion matters. Because we're all suffering, though we're not suffering equally, we're all changed by the pandemic. We've got more empathy for the suffering of others, and we need that. We need an empathy for the issues that Vera raised about Africa. We need to have much more solidarity if we're going to leave no one behind, as the 2030 agenda has asked us to. I know you want people to be brief, so I think I'll stop there. I could go on and talk more, as I will in the second half, about the bottom-up human rights approach, the climate justice approach. But I really do think COVID has disrupted us in a way that enables us to do what I'm hearing on this platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you for bringing in the moral dimension and talking about compassion and so on. These are not just technical issues at all. They are spiritual issues as well. So I'll come back to you soon because you were so good in keeping to time. So, thanks very much. Mark Carney, in addition to being one of the leading central bankers in the world, you also are the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and you were chair of the G20 Finance Stability Board. So you know more about shifting finance than anyone alive, I think. Recently, you said also you were quite encouraged because you felt there was an opportunity to change and leapfrog. Could you say a little about that?
Thank you, Andrew, and hello to my fellow panelists, Vera, Mary, Carlos. And may I begin by commending Minister Koizumi for his leadership in reducing Japan's coal financing, his leadership with local governments. It's truly extraordinary what's happened there, and his leadership here in a call for action for redesign. And Andrew, you're going right to the heart of it. How do we redesign finance? First thing is the objective. We want by COP26 to be in a position so every professional financial decision takes climate change into account. Just like every financial decision takes into account interest rates or credit risk, those factors, climate change should be a fundamental and decisive factor in every financial decision. And we need 4 building blocks for that. And I'll just touch on them briefly and we can draw into them a bit more. The first is we need reporting. We need better reporting. Japan has led the way. The minister mentioned this. Japan has more companies, major companies that report on TCFD. That's true leadership. There's now $140 trillion of balance sheet of major financial institutions around the world who want our major companies to report on TCFD standards. So the job for Glasgow is to move something from the private sector initiative and embed it, make it mandatory across the G20 countries. Secondly, around risks. There are 60 central banks and supervisors covering 2/3 of the world's emissions that have come together in something called the NGFS. What they are doing is ensuring that our banks think about how they're financing climate risks. It goes back to the coal financing, other issues. Are they setting up a situation where there's stranded assets? And if so, what are they going to do about it? That's through technology like stress testing. And I'll just make this point, which is one of the reasons why the financial sector has been part of the solution during COVID is because we stress tested them against other risks. Now let's make sure they're part of the solution for climate. Third point is around returns. I'll just ask it as a question, and we can draw it out in the broader discussion, which is, it's all of our money ultimately that's in a pension fund or in an asset manager or in a bank. How is that money being invested or lent out? Is it consistent with what our local governments and national governments are doing, what people want? Is it consistent with the transition to net zero? Last point. We need a cross-border market, a professional cross-border market for nature-based solutions and for carbon offsets. That is one of the key things that will magnify, amplify flows from advanced to emerging and developing countries. It will help with the bridges in the energy transition that Vera discussed at the start. We have commissioned that from the private sector, led by Bill Winters, launched yesterday, and reporting by the end of the year. And with that, Andrew, I'm going to hand back. Thanks.
Wow, that was great, Mark. That was so crystal clear. I'm going to come back to you very soon. I'd like to go back to Mary, if I could. Mary, when Minister KOIZUMI sort of laid out this idea of redesign, there were three elements: decarbonization, move to circular economy, and what he called decentralization. And decentralization is not only to cities and communities, it's actually to individuals, and it's sort of basically empowering people. Could you say, how do you feel? I mean, we're seeing this incredible sort of recognition now of social injustice in the world and decision making. Could you address the environment ministers who are listening on that subject?
I'm so glad that Minister KOIZUMI has highlighted decentralization as one of the three pillars. I couldn't agree more. And that means building resilience kind of bottom up in communities. Who does nature-based solutions well? Communities, and actually farmers, if they're doing farming in a way that's sustainable with nature. And we have to get away from the bad practices, and a lot of offsetting is not good. I've seen some very bad examples. It's the way people want to pretend or get on a fast road to decarbonizing, but actually it may not be true. So we need true nature-based solutions, and those need to be close to indigenous communities, frontline protectors of land and water rights. We actually see many people killed. The number of defenders of land and water rights that are killed each year, either because they're interfering with mining or they're interfering with other developments, so-called, that are not respecting the land and water rights. So these are really important issues, and a lot of them are linked to climate justice. If I may very briefly give you the 5 layers of climate justice that I've now identified. The first layer is that climate change disproportionately affects the poorest countries, poorest communities, small island states, and indigenous peoples, and there's a lot of link with racial justice in that. Secondly, within that, the gender dimensions, that women have less land rights, less access to capital, less rights generally, different social roles, and yet they have to put food on the table and get water during drought. So the gender dimension is really very important, and women's agency is very important. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice that the children of the world are calling us out on with their Fridays for Future. They're reminding us we're not providing a safe future, and they're still very angry. They don't think we're doing enough. Fourthly, and this is for Vera, the different pathways to industrialization. The developed world, the industrialized world, had the pathway of fossil fuel, and we must respect the workers in coal, oil, and gas for that reason. And we have to wean ourselves off as urgently as possible. But developing countries want to develop and bring their people out of poverty, and they want to do it with clean energy, but they need the technology, the investment, the skills, etc. And the fifth layer, and I'll finish with this, is nature herself, and that has been well spoken about by Carlos. The fact that we have such loss of biodiversity, such extinction of species, destroying of the ecosystems that sustain us is not clever at all. And we have to reverse that very dramatically. And if we bear in mind those 5 layers and have a climate justice, people-centered approach, it's not just all of government that has to be concerned about climate, it's all of people. Towns and cities and parishes and villages and communities. And this is the way that we will make the transformation that is needed, bottom up as well as top down. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Mary, so much. That was really wonderful. I'd like to go back to Mark, actually, because you laid out the 4 issues, all of them strong, all of them basically saying we need to act sooner rather than later. Could you say a word about that? I mean, on reporting, you said we've got to move from private voluntarism to mandatory and so on. I mean, think about the environment ministers who are on the line right now, will be speaking in a minute. They go into cabinet rooms, they talk to their central bank governors. How would you urge them to be effective in moving this forward, and how can they bring in the private sector, who sometimes are sort of ahead of the curve on this?
Thank you, Andrew. So I'll say one thing about reporting. The first on reporting is it's foundational. What gets measured gets managed. Manage the risk and manage the returns. And so the challenge to the environment ministers, the ministers of finance, the heads of government, is that we need to move this, as you just said, from the private voluntary. They've taken it a huge way to make it mandatory, have pathways to mandatory. And actually, the good news is we're getting the standard setters, something called the IFRS, which sets global standards for disclosure, IOSCO, which is the securities regulators, the FSB, others engaged in this. And it needs that political push, that political nudge to push it over the line. And then particularly importantly, given that there's 88 countries on this meeting, this is not just scope 1, scope 2. If it's scope 3, then the reporting of companies in, let's call it the G20, goes up and down the supply chain and spreads out across the world and gives them an incentive to invest in low carbon solutions. That's the first point. The second point is all of those 88 countries and beyond will be submitting NDCs with objectives there. Well, what are the NDCs equivalent for the asset managers, the asset owners, our insurance companies, our pension funds? What are they doing in order to transition towards net zero? And there is leadership again shown through Japan. Japan's pension fund, the GPIF, $1.6 trillion, calculates how that money is invested and whether it's consistent with the transition that is the objective of the people of Japan, and gives a sense of where the degree warming is. Now, we are going to bring that, quote, technology, financial technology, to the financial sector over the course of the next 6 months and challenge them to come clean on what types of emissions are they financing. Last point, what that does, and it won't be a pretty picture, to be clear, the market is financing at present something like a 3.5 degree outcome by the end of this century. Shouldn't be a surprise given who's on the call, we all know this. But the challenge then is for them to commit to manage that down to something consistent with 1.5 degrees in a disciplined way. And so again, for the ministers of environment, ministers of finance, others, is to ask those questions because the technology, financial technology, is there to give the answers. Thanks.
Thank you. And presumably every NDC should have a financial sector component to it, I assume. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, Andrew. And it should have a private financial sector component as well as the public financial. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Vera, could we continue on the theme of decentralization? You have been a leader as a leading economist for many years on issues of cities and how cities grow and how energy systems within cities and so on. For Africa, a huge source of dynamism and a huge challenge as well. Vera, are you there? I think we've lost Vera. Maybe she didn't like the question. So we'll come back. We'll come back to Vera. We'll go to Carlos. Carlos, you're taking over the Global Environment Facility, which is sort of the financing mechanism for the global commons. I mean, it's terribly exciting. Could you just say a word? What is your offer to these 80 ministers, particularly in this concept of redesign?
Well, thank you for this, Andrew. And yes, It's very interesting because over the last decade, the GEF has framed its investment strategy around major economic systems that are the sources of pressure to the planet. We work on urban systems, energy systems, food system, and the linear, unsustainable model of consumption and production. So the GEF is not working on the problem rather than on the root of the problem. Nevertheless, the trust fund is not enough. We can double and triple the size of the GEF trust fund, and that will never be enough to match the gap within what we are financing in terms of climate mitigation and implementing the SDGs or protecting nature with the needs, the financial needs. As a matter of fact, we can double and triple ODA and the international flow of financial resources from the north to the south, that will never be enough. So here at the GEF, we got two things which are extremely clear. One, countries need to understand that it's in their very own self-interest to protecting nature, to be on track with the 1.5, and to have high ambition on how we should protect nature. And I hope that countries agree on a very ambitious post-2020 framework in the context of the CBD. Our scientific community are telling us that we need to restore and protect nature of around 30% by 2030. So under that framework and challenges, I think that there's a lot of space for countries to do much better in domestic mobilization of resources. The same way that countries realize that it's in their own self-interest to educate and have healthy people, they need to mobilize resources. And there is we may think that there is a limitation of mobilizing domestic resources. And once more, there are many cases where the GEF does work, that the GEF becomes a catalyzer investment that mobilize willingness and understanding, where there's policy enhancement and new legal framework that help us do two things: mobilize domestic resources, but most importantly, began the phasing out of those negative policies that promote climate change and deforestation. So phasing the GEF looks very closely to generate data that helps countries generate political dialogues that will help them understand how do they do the transition. And the transition is not just a transition from dirty energy into clean energy. It's a transition towards a circular economic system, providing sound economic data on the cost benefit of doing that is critical. And these are all areas where the GEF is working very strongly.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Carlos. Vera, are you back with us now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I cannot speak.
Oh, no, you can. We can hear you speak now.
Oh, okay. Oh, I thought I was muted. Great.
Did you hear the question? Basically, the cities of Africa are suffering hugely because of COVID. The economy is down. You've written a lot and spoken a lot on the role of cities in the dynamic future of Africa. How do you see this a huge challenge, but a huge opportunity?
No, thank you very much. And I think I want to pick up from where Mary left off. One of the things that we're doing at the ECA is we've just designed what we call the SDG 7 initiative. And the SDG 7 initiative is actually a combination of three things, and I'm going to add a fourth because Mary's here now. The first one is on the NDCs. And essentially, as we all know, Africa came to the table during the COP21 in Paris with sort of, this big ambition to really transition in a big way. But we were not able to do that because the resources that were then supposed to be put together to do that didn't materialize. What we then decided to do at the ECA is say, how can we go to the private sector? And this is what Mark is talking about, the trillions of dollars in pension funds that we can redirect. Honestly, the only real new solid investments in energy and the energy transition today in the world are on the continent in Africa. If we need to make the kinds of returns that pension funds are looking for across the world, but particularly in countries like Japan, Africa is the one that is going to deliver those kinds of returns for you, but deliver them in a good way. And so we can actually find a way of getting to the NDCs and ensuring financing. The second thing that we're doing with the SDG7 initiative is looking at governance. And that's where I think the decentralization conversation becomes important, because actually when you start talking about governance, you go back to nature-based solutions. You go back to the communities and the individuals. The government of Ethiopia just recently decided to plant 5 billion trees. And what we did was come together and say to them, how can we help you with nature-based solutions? Essentially, we planted trees that are fruit trees, so that the young kids trees can actually then get a livelihood. They also then decided that as planting process, we will move women from cooking stoves to more, from cooking with wood to more efficient cooking stoves. Just as a statistics, we have about 3.7 million women in the world that die from respiratory diseases because of poor cooking. On the continent, it's about 700,000. And that goes to Mary's point about women being, again, the most disadvantaged. If we do an SDG 7 or an energy or sustainability initiative that works with local communities, we start handling these things. And that is the circular economy. And then finally, of course, is the question. So I talked about the NDCs, the questions around governance, and particularly important, we need governance at the local levels. We know that the closer government is to the people, the more accountable it is. And so both for energy, but also for the kinds of solutions that you bring to job creation, to greening your economy, it's much, much easier to do it at the local government level. And finally, on the financing side, we've come together with some of the large financiers, PIMCO, for example, to say a lot of the African governments today are still managing energy assets. They don't need to manage energy assets. What they need to do is manage the provision of energy for business and for the private sector. So what we can actually do is repurchase those energy assets and then support them in how they transition into a better energy future. And so part of this work that we're doing, and we hope that we can get the government of Japan and some of the Japanese private sector, and maybe Mark, a lot of the financial sector as we do the IFCC, to come together with us and say, you know, there is at least $1 trillion worth of energy assets on the continent today that we can repurchase and give African governments and African civil society and African local governments and African business the ability to produce a lot more energy in a much shorter time and decrease this carbon contribution we're talking about. So I think three things: NDCs, we can meet them if we bring the private sector, the public sector, and local governments together. The governance systems from the bottom up all the way to the top, but also from the top down. And then finally, how we do it with financing. And it's great to have Mark here because he can help us figure that out. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vera, very much indeed. We've come to the end of this session, I'm afraid. I thought it was wonderful. I heard some very, very clear messages, which I hope now get picked up in the very important ministerial session, which is coming. And then session 3 will bring non-state actors. And one of the things that came through so clearly is we need a new kind of partnership, institutions that bring different players together. Extremely strong messages on decentralization, Minister KOIZUMI, and particularly on justice. And Mary, thank you for your five issues that we all need to study and learn and practice. And then on finance, I mean, Mark, I've rarely heard such a coherent sort of fourfold approach. So it seems to me there's a very coherent emerging narrative, and the narrative is economic development must not suffer, it need not suffer. The right kinds of pro-growth, pro-job, pro-poor policies will actually be the kinds of policies and investments that will lead to a greener, cleaner, and a more sustainable world. I think there's a huge amount of evidence that's now coming out on that. So thank you, all of you. By the way, I mean, over the last few months, there's been a terrific sort of intellectual journey. Starting in the UNFCCC meeting last December, the Petersburg Dialogue, a lot of discussion on this issue. Since then, in thanks to the German government and to you, Minister KOIZUMI, in a whole series of webinars. This week, a major report was issued, which is now on the platform, produced jointly by the Minister of Environment of Germany and the World Resources Institute, trying to bring these lessons together. And now the platform, which you've established, Minister, together with Patricia Espinosa, is really going to play a very, very important role. So I'd like to turn it back to you, Minister, just to summarize how you feel that session now leads us to the ministerial session. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and the distinguished panelists. Really inspiring. I found a lot of new insights from this panel and hope the same is true to many other participants. This session touched upon what roles the government and the financial sector can play and how important it is to strengthen international solidarity in advancing the three transitions. The three transitions can provide a competitive advantage in the rapidly changing global economy and could be an engine for economic growth. These three transitions could also be seen as a form of vaccine for the global economy to prevent future climate risks. I hope you all agree the proactive vaccination through these three transitions is a cost-effective way to prepare for similar crises in the future. Thank you again, Andrew. Your facilitation was terrific. You were an excellent chair. I also thank all the panelists. Thank you, everybody.